At 2:11 a.m., on a suffocating winter night in 1943, Staff Sergeant Walter Briggs crouched in the mud beneath a tangle of banyan roots on Bougainville. The rain had stopped 40 minutes earlier, but the jungle still dripped, every branch breathing humidity as if the entire island were alive. Visibility was barely an arm's length. His uniform clung to him like wet cloth on a scarecrow, and a thin film of steam rose from his shoulders every time he exhaled. He held a weapon no raider wanted to be seen with, a tiny .380 auto pistol taken from a dead Japanese officer. A joke! A toy! Something men laughed about. And yet he kept it under his arm like it was the only real thing left in the dark. Briggs was 27, hardened by 41 night patrols and 18 close-range engagements. He had survived 3 encirclements, 2 broken lines, and 1 disastrous ambush. But the statistic that haunted him most was the one he could not shake: 5 raiders lost in 14 days. Not because they were outnumbered. Not because they were outgunned. But because the enemy always saw them first. My name is Berg, and if you're here, you love the kind of history they don't put in textbooks. Subscribe to Firepower World War II so we can bring stories like this, stories buried in mud, silence, and forgotten reports, back into the light. Briggs listened to the jungle with the tension of a man waiting for something he already feared. The usual chorus of insects was there, but muted, as if even they understood who truly owned the night. Somewhere ahead, Japanese scouts moved with the effortless stealth that had broken so many raider patrols. They had mastered the terrain long before the first American boots hit the edge of the island. And tonight, Briggs had been tasked yet again with slipping behind their lines to map a narrow supply route cut through the vines. The terrain favored the Japanese in every way. When American rifles snagged on branches, theirs glided through. When American boots cracked twigs, theirs whispered past. On Bougainville, even seconds felt like disadvantages. He watched the silhouettes of his remaining men, 7 now, down from the 12 he began the month with. They were bowed, thin, exhausted. Their faces were lined with dirt and that quiet dread men carry when they've seen too many friends pulled into the dark without warning. The enemy didn't need to surround them, they only needed to wait. Every attempt at an ambush had collapsed the same way, a soft shuffle in the brush, a sudden whisper of leaves, and before anyone on Briggs's side could raise a rifle, a Japanese patrol would appear from an angle no one expected. It was like fighting ghosts who understood every inch of the terrain. 2 weeks earlier, Corporal Henry Mason had whispered from the left flank that he saw movement. Briggs barely turned before a Japanese scout burst from a curtain of vines and drove a bayonet into Mason's chest. The boy from Oklahoma barely dropped his harmonica before his legs gave out. Mason had been fast, skilled, brave, but his rifle had been too long to clear the brush in time. Days later, Joe Tahara, the best tracker they had, a man who could spot a footprint in the dark, lost his life because his M1 carbine jammed after the humidity swelled its already temperamental magazine. Tahara died 3 feet from Briggs, close enough that Briggs still remembered the sound of the misfed round clicking uselessly before a muzzle flash spat from the dark. These weren't mistakes. They were patterns. And they brought Briggs to a question he couldn't avoid. How do you fight an enemy who lives inside the margins of jungle darkness? How do you win at distances where rifles become liabilities, where a single vine can slow your trigger pull, where the enemy closes the gap before you even realize there is one? Standard doctrine required distance, 10, 20, 30 meters, but Bougainville gave them 2 at best, often less. Carbines required a shoulder to brace against, space to swing, and enough clearance to aim. Thick vegetation turned all that into fantasy. Long-barreled rifles created blind spots that swallowed entire patrols. By the time a raider saw movement, the Japanese scout was already inside the arc of the weapon. Briggs knew the problem wasn't bravery or training. It was geometry. tactics built for clear lines of sight crumbled where the world collapsed into roots and vines. He needed something that could work in cramped space, something that didn't rely on distance at all. And that brought him back to the pistol tucked under his arm. The very weapon the others ridiculed every time it came up. A compact .380 with almost no stopping power outside a few yards, but here, yards didn't exist. Here, everything happened at the beat of a heartbeat. The idea came to him not like a bolt of inspiration, but like a slow-forming certainty. The enemy was beating them because their weapons were built for another world. So what if the smallest, most underestimated tool was actually the one suited for this fight? A pistol that didn't snag, didn't need range, didn't require both hands, and drew quicker than any rifle ever could. But regulations were clear. Unauthorized sidearms could cost him rank or more. A Marine Raider wasn't supposed to improvise weapons. They were supposed to follow standards, trust issued gear, trust doctrine. Briggs looked at the wet jungle, the heavy rifles, the exhausted faces. Doctrine wasn't bleeding in the mud. His men were. He made the choice quietly. He waited until the others settled into their foxholes that night. Then, in a sliver of darkness beneath a collapsed palm trunk, he pulled a tiny pistol from his pack. It felt absurdly light in his hand, almost flimsy. He field-stripped it with practiced care, cleaning every part with a torn patch of shirt and a few drops of motor oil. The metal gleamed faintly in the moon-filtered mist. Briggs wrapped the grip with friction tape scavenged from radio gear to keep the sweat from making it slick. Then he practiced. He practiced a draw in total silence, thumb under the slide, wrist turned inward to clear a curtain of vines, barrel angled upward to avoid snagging. He tested firing positions, kneeling, crouched, pressed between roots, pinned against a trunk. The pistol whispered through the air in a way no carbine could. He could bring it from his chest to firing alignment in under a second. He didn't need reach. He didn't need leverage. He only needed speed. At one point, the tape roll fell from his hand, striking the earth with a dull thud. Briggs froze, lungs locked, listening for enemy movement. Nothing. But the fear of being caught with the pistol, of some officer deciding this was grounds for punishment, stayed with him. He kept practicing until his hand memorized every motion and the pistol felt like an extension of his own will. When he finally holstered it beneath his left arm, one realization settled into him like the weight of a new bone. For the first time in weeks, he felt he might actually have a weapon that belonged to this place. And in a few hours, the jungle would give him a chance to prove it. By the time the first hints of pre-dawn light filtered through the canopy, Briggs and his men were deep behind enemy lines again, moving with the measured caution of men who understood how quickly the jungle could turn from silent to fatal. Their boots sank into layers of rotted leaves. Vines clung to their gear like skeletal fingers. The air tasted of iron and wet moss. They followed a narrow ridge leading to a suspected Japanese courier trail, one of the arteries feeding the enemy's inland strongpoints. Under normal conditions, the patrol would have been tense. After 2 weeks of losses, it felt like walking into the memory of every ambush they had survived. Briggs kept a little .380 pressed close to his chest, beneath a damp strip of cloth to shield its dull metal from the moonlight. The rest of the raiders lifted their rifles in a low-ready stance, eyes sweeping shadows that shifted with every flicker of wind. Briggs couldn't blame them. Even he still wanted to believe in the reassuring weight of a long gun. But the jungle punished reassurance. It punished hesitation. And he knew what waited beyond every narrow turn. The first sign of trouble was a single, barely audible step somewhere ahead, too soft for boots, too intentional for an animal. Briggs felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. His patrol slowed without a word. Every man crouched. Breaths shortened. The jungle seemed to inhale with them. Then, for a fleeting moment, it was utterly quiet. A silhouette appeared through the vines. A Japanese scout, crouched low, sliding forward with a bayonet fixed to his rifle. No flashlight. No sound. No warning. The same pattern. The same nightmare. The same 2 seconds in which a raider usually died. But this time Briggs didn't try to swing a rifle. He didn't step back or freeze or attempt to shoulder a weapon longer than his arm. He moved the pistol as he had practiced, straight up, inward, angled through the foliage. The motion was so fast and so fluid that even he barely registered the draw before the trigger pressed back. The small pistol cracked once, a muted snap compared to the thunder of a carbine. The scout collapsed onto his knees without a cry, falling forward into the wet leaves. 2 more Japanese soldiers emerged almost instantly, answering the movement rather than the sound. Briggs pivoted on his heel, the pistol punching through a curtain of hanging vines. A second shot. A third. They fell before their boots could plant firmly in the soil. None of the raiders had time to raise their rifles. It all happened in the span of one breath. For the first time in weeks, the ambush didn't belong to the enemy. The squad stared at Briggs in stunned silence, eyes wide, lungs refusing to exhale until they felt certain this wasn't another trick of the jungle. Sergeant Howard, the second in command, shook his head with the stiff disbelief of a man who had run out of explanations long ago. Briggs only gave a slight nod, the pistol still steady in his hands. They cleared the area quickly, dragging the bodies into the brush, examining the fallen scouts' gear for maps, notes, anything that might help. The mission continued, quieter than before, but with a new undercurrent moving through the men, something like hope, though no one dared say the word aloud. By the time they returned to their forward position later that morning, rumors had already reached the other raider platoons. Men gathered around Briggs before he had even set his pack down. They wanted to know what he had done. What the weapon was. How he had seen the scout in time. Briggs answered simply, it wasn't about seeing faster. It was about drawing faster. Most didn't understand at first. They clung to the idea that bigger guns offered safety. But when Briggs explained how rifles became dead weight in the tight undergrowth, how long barrels blocked movement, how shouldering took time they didn't have, how the pistols were silent to maneuver with, the logic began sinking in. Time and distance were everything, and Bougainville offered neither. A weapon that excelled at 30 yards was useless at 2 feet if you could not aim it in time to save your life. Within days, small pistols began showing up all over the raider camp. Some were captured Japanese sidearms. Others were old civilian pocket autos shipped quietly in personal parcels. A few were obtained through supply loopholes or trades with Navy personnel. Briggs never encouraged anyone explicitly, he didn't have to. The results spoke louder than any instruction manual ever could. The next mission proved the shift was real. Briggs's patrol, this time armed with 5 compact pistols concealed among their standard weapons, encountered 2 Japanese scouts approaching from opposing flanks. In the past, the raiders would have suffered immediate casualties from the split. Instead, the squad reacted as a single organism. Pistols cleared the brush in all directions. Quick, precise shots. No wasted movement. The entire engagement ended in less than 3 seconds. No Americans wounded. No rifles jammed. No men dragged out bleeding because their carbines snagged on vines. Word spread through the company at a pace faster than official reports could file. By the end of the month, more than 30 raiders carried small pistols during silent patrols. Close combat casualties dropped by nearly 70%. The Japanese, once so confident in night superiority, began encountering patrols that fought like they understood every branch and route. They widened their own spacing, changed routes, increased scouts, but the result stayed the same. The advantage had shifted, even if only by inches. In the jungle, Inches were everything. During this time, the raiders refined their tactics. Pistol carriers moved on the flanks. Riflemen stayed central. The smallest sidearms were assigned to men who navigated the thickest brush. Teams communicated with subtle gestures, hand signals that allowed them to pivot instantly when a scout emerged. They learned to treat every two-step gap in vision as a possible attack. They used the jungle itself as a series of ambush pockets. The patrol formation evolved from a rigid column into a breathing, adaptive shape that moved like water through tangled roots. But changes this effective never go unnoticed by those tasked with enforcing rules. One early morning, after a long patrol, Briggs stood over a tin mug of weak coffee in the makeshift command hut when a supply officer approached. Lieutenant Raymond Keller, a man known for keeping immaculate paperwork even in the mud, motioned for Briggs to follow him to the rear inspection area. Briggs's stomach tightened immediately. He knew this was not about rations. 3 unauthorized pistols had been discovered in a gear sweep, one belonging to Briggs himself. Keller inspected the weapons with an expression caught between disapproval and disbelief. He asked the questions expected of his role. Who approved this? Why weren't these logged? Do you understand the consequences? Briggs answered honestly but carefully. He explained the tactical gap the pistols filled. He explained the speed, the maneuverability, the distance factor. He spoke with the quiet conviction of a man who had seen too many friends die to pretend the issued gear was enough. Keller wasn't convinced, not at first. Regulations were regulations. Unauthorized weapons meant disciplinary action. But before Keller could finish the lecture he had been rehearsing, Captain Donnelly stepped into the tent. He had heard the rumors, seen the casualty numbers, read the patrol reports. He knew the truth. Something had changed, and for the better. Donnelly took one of the pistols, weighing it in his hand. Then he turned to Keller and stated in a tone that allowed no argument, "If these weapons reduce our losses, then I am not interested in the ledger." Keller hesitated, but he understood orders when he heard them. The pistols stayed. The paperwork was quietly set aside, folded into a drawer where inconvenient truths were left to gather dust. Briggs never claimed victory in the matter. He never declared himself right. The war had little use for pride. But the men knew the truth. They saw it every time they returned from patrol with the same number of boots that had left. Weeks passed, and the pistols became as much a part of raider identity as the knives strapped to their ankles. They trained with them, shared techniques, perfected one-handed firing methods. Some carved makeshift holsters out of leather scraps. Others wrapped their grips the same way Briggs had, using friction tape to fight the sweat-heavy humidity. They became faster, quieter, more decisive. The jungle began reacting to them, not the other way around. Official reports, however, told a different story. They credited the improved performance to enhanced night infiltration training and refined close-quarters protocols. Not a single line mentioned Briggs or the pistols. Not a single officer outside Donnelly acknowledged that innovation often came from the ground up, from men who bent rules because the alternative was death. Briggs didn't mind. Recognition was never the point. The point was survival. And survival would demand even more from him before the campaign was over. As the Bougainville campaign stretched into its most grueling phase, the raiders found themselves pushing deeper into enemy-held territory than anyone had expected them to reach. Weeks of night patrols had carved their instincts into razor edges. Every sound became a warning, every shadow a possible ambush, every breath measured against what might be hiding just ahead. Yet for the first time since their arrival, they did not feel like prey. The pistol carriers had transformed the tempo of close combat, forcing the Japanese to rethink their favored tactics. It did not make the war easier, but it made it survivable. Briggs's own responsibilities expanded. What had begun as a quiet personal decision became something larger, something that pulled men toward him. Younger raiders sought him out for advice, not because he held rank, but because he possessed something rare, clarity. He showed them how to move through the jungle without letting the jungle move through them. He taught them grip transitions, elbow angles, how to draw from a crouch without losing balance, how to keep their weapons dry without revealing their location. And when they asked why he trusted the tiny pistol so much, he never romanticized it. He told them the truth, that the pistol was never meant to be a hero's weapon. It was simply the right tool for the wrong environment, and sometimes that was enough. In early February, during an operation meant to sever a newly built Japanese supply artery, Briggs's squad faced the kind of confrontation that would have broken them only a month earlier. They approached a ravine dense with bamboo, where visibility collapsed into a blur of vertical lines. The raiders moved in 2 columns, pistols at the ready for the men on the flanks, rifles carried by those in the rear. The air felt charged, heavy, vibrating with the static tension of something waiting to happen. Then it happened. A Japanese platoon, nearly twice their number, emerged from the ravine in coordinated silence. The lead scouts slipped between bamboo stalks like shadows with rifles. The middle wave carried grenades and reserve ammunition. The rear guard held bayonets already angled forward. It was the largest enemy patrol Briggs had ever seen at such close distance. Under any other circumstance, the raiders would have died where they stood. But the new formation, the one born from necessity and shaped by failure, held. The pistol carriers on the flanks fired first, 3 shots each, barely louder than snapping branches. Scouts fell before they realized who or what had struck them. The Japanese middle ranks hesitated, disoriented by the direction of the sound, expecting heavy rifle fire, not sharp, concise cracks coming from impossible angles. That single breath of confusion gave the raiders time to reposition. The riflemen, now with room to aim, opened controlled bursts into the ravine. The bamboo lit with flashes. Wet leaves exploded into fragments. The initial Japanese push faltered, its forward momentum broken by the sheer unpredictability of the raiders' coordinated response. Briggs moved through the chaos with a calm that felt almost unnatural. He cleared angles, pivoted through bamboo stalks, and guided the flanks with subtle gestures. When a Japanese soldier lunged at him with a bayonet, Briggs spun left, caught the soldier's momentum, and fired once into the chest from less than an arm's reach. The pistol barely kicked. Within seconds, the ravine transformed into a choking haze of smoke and torn foliage. Then silence, deep, heavy, choking silence. The kind that follows only when a fight ends quickly enough that the mind has not yet registered its own survival. The raiders regrouped, checked one another for wounds, counted heads. Every man was still standing. That moment became a quiet turning point in the entire Bougainville campaign. From that day on, higher command could no longer deny the statistical shift unfolding in their reports. Patrols led by Briggs and the pistol carriers consistently returned with fewer casualties and more actionable intelligence. Encounters that once ended in panic now ended in measured precision. The enemy's night advantage dissolved inch by inch, until the Japanese began choosing retreat over engagement when they spotted the faint outlines of raider movement. And yet, none of these changes appeared in the official press releases or formal histories drafted during the war. The reason was simple: no one in headquarters wanted to admit that a field sergeant had solved a problem the doctrine had created. Innovation, especially from the bottom, threatened the structure upon which authority rested. Briggs understood this without bitterness. He had never cared for credit. He cared only for the men who walked back from the jungle with him. When the war finally ended, Briggs returned to Oregon. He married a woman he had written 3 letters to during the rainy season. He worked as a train mechanic, the kind of job that rewarded the patient strength he carried with him from the Pacific. He raised 2 children who knew him as a steady, quietly humorous presence. The pistol stayed locked in a small wooden box in his garage, wrapped in the same cloth he had used to hide it on patrol. He never displayed it. He never mentioned it. When he did speak of the war, it was always with an understated distance, like he was telling someone else's story. But time has a way of circling back to what matters. In the mid-1980s, a military historian named Jonathan Hale began researching obscure radar operations, drawn by the strange discrepancy between casualty numbers in Bougainville and other campaigns. Hale found footnotes buried in declassified reports, cryptic references to close-quarters microfire tactics, mentions of pocket autos, unusual comments in after-action logs. Curious, he tracked down surviving raiders. Many had aged into retirement homes, their memories softened but not erased. One after another, they told him about Briggs. They spoke of the quiet sergeant who never raised his voice, who never demanded authority, who simply stepped into the gaps left by fear. They remembered how he trained them without ever calling it training. They remembered the pistol not as a miracle, but as a symbol of refusing to die for a doctrine that did not understand the ground they walked on. Hale compiled their accounts, wrote letters to families, pieced together the story that had never made it into any official archive. The most moving interview came from the widow of a raider who had survived a 1943 patrol because Briggs had seen a scout seconds before anyone else. Hale showed her an excerpt from a patrol log describing the incident. She read it silently, fingers trembling. Then she whispered that her husband had never told her how close he came to dying that night. She had lived decades without knowing who to thank. Hale later published the story in a small military journal with limited circulation. Few read it. Fewer still understood its significance. But the truth does not need millions of eyes to exist. It only needs enough to keep its memory alive. If you visit certain museums today, you might find a display of World War II sidearms in a dimly lit corner. You may see a small pistol among the others, a model without a plaque, without a name, without a story. To most visitors, it is a curiosity. To those who know, it is something else entirely. It is a reminder that sometimes the smallest things matter most. That survival often depends on the courage of individuals who break rules not for glory, but for each other. Official records say innovation came from command decisions. But the real legacy belongs to the men who fought the war, not the ones who wrote about it afterward. Men like Walter Briggs, who changed the course of jungle warfare not with authority, but with instinct, desperation, and a refusal to keep losing friends. Most people never heard his name. Now you have. And knowing his story is a way of honoring the men who carried unseen burdens through the darkest parts of the war. If this story moved you, help us keep forgotten histories alive. Like this video so more people can find it. Subscribe to Firepower World War II and join a community that safeguards the past one story at a time. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Every voice helps preserve the memory of those who never sought recognition, only survival.